Hello, church. I am bummed that I can't be with you today, but I am so excited that you get to spend this time today and these next several weeks with Reverend John Buenz. John will be doing forum. Hello, church. I am bummed that I can't be with you today, but I am so excited that you get to spend this time today and these next several weeks with Reverend John Buenz. John will be doing two forum series with us over the next several weeks. He's going to start out today with an introduction and talking about the Crucible of Faith. We've shared the links to the books. You don't have to read the books, but you are welcome to do so. Crucible of Faith by Philip Jenkins, and then After Jesus, Before Christianity by the Westar Institute, the folks who brought us the Jesus Seminar. John's going to be talking about all of that stuff, giving you a great introduction, and I'm so grateful that he has agreed and has time and space in his schedule to come and be with us over the next several weeks. I look forward to watching the recording of this forum, and I will be back with us all next week as we continue to dig into this and learn and grow together. All right, for now, you guys have a great time with John, and I will see you all this week when we're back from vacation. Bye for now.
I hope you could hear him. Can you hear me? That's good. I'm glad. I've got a microphone. Maybe I could do without a microphone. You think so?
It's so they're recording it.
Recording.
Watching online.
Got it. Right. Fine. Well, nice to be back here this morning. And my name is John Buenz, and I served here from 1973 to 1986. It's a long time ago. Resigned from here and went to Spokane to do something different there, and then came back, and my wife and I now live where I lived when I served at St. Jude's. So it's good to be back. Years ago, when I came on board, I started a Sunday seminar, and when I went to Spokane, my predecessor already had one, so I stepped right into that. So we'll hope I'll know what I'm doing here this morning. This is still the Easter season, so I decided that we'd do something for a forum that was Easter-like, but not exactly Easter, in that what I'm going to be offering will be a look at the world in which Jesus was born into, with all the different ways in which they thought about things. And that's the first book, which is called Crucible of Faith. And I'm going to be talking largely about Crucible of Faith this morning. This is not an easy read. By the way, these two books and the information they contained was not even available when I graduated from seminary in 1965. So I don't know about what they're doing there now, whether this has reached the seminary or not. But do you know what they're doing? She doesn't know either. So we're both born too early, weren't we? Right. So I'm going to be talking this morning largely about the Crucible of Faith, and then for the following 3 Sundays, I'll be taking you through a volume which is called After Jesus and Before Christianity. And you'll be learning that for the first 200 years or so following the death of Jesus, there was no such thing as Christianity. And this is a very interesting book that I think is going to be very widely read throughout the church. But I'm going to be beginning with the Crucible of Faith. Now, largely because I believe in what I call the cultural environment that shapes people's lives. These two books will talk about the environment, the cultural environment that shaped the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And then after Jesus, before Christianity, we'll be taking a look at the environment of the Roman Empire and how early followers of Jesus managed and lived during the first 200 years following his death. I'm interested in cultural environments. First of all, the word culture comes from the Latin word cultivare, which means to cultivate. It's like how the ground gets plowed. And when you talk about culture, you're talking about the values that people have, the language they speak, the folk ways they have of doing things. And so everybody lives in some kind of cultural environment. These two books explore those cultural environments. Crucible of Faith is about the ancient revolution that made our modern world. It was written by a man that teaches at Baylor University. And the other has got to do with an historical exploration of the first 2 centuries of what I call the Jesus movement. And those will be the last, the second, third, and fourth seminars that I'll be offering this spring. First of all, about the Crucible of Faith by Philip Jenkins, Baylor University. Crucible is a word I had never thought about in terms of I had never thought about it very much at all until I read the book. A crucible is a container that mixes various dissimilar elements under heat and pressure. It's a container that mixes dissimilar elements under heat and pressure. And it's a very interesting word, I think, to talk about that in terms of the 200 years before the birth of Jesus. But I'm going to talk a little bit about crucible as just a thought for you to try and make this a little bit more of a relevant presentation for you. And I'm going to be thinking a little bit about a number of what I would call crucible situations in our own experience. And we are in one now, by the way, in case you didn't know it. We are definitely, our nation and a lot of the world is under a real, in a kind of what I call a crucible situation, in that various elements are getting mixed together under heat and pressure. And if you don't know that, then you might start reading the newspaper and you'll find out that we're definitely in that kind of situation right now. When I think about public, and you can follow the outline, I've got an outline for you. They wanted me to do a PowerPoint, but I'm a digital dinosaur. So I did the same old thing that I've always done. I just did an outline. So you'll have an outline for each one of the presentations and you can follow that along and you can kind of see the drift of things or take it home and think about it a little bit if you're really interested in what I have to say. I'm down to first Crucible of Faith. Crucible, one of them is we have what I would call a public crucible situation. The Ukraine is certainly one, isn't it? Boy, the people that live there are in that kind of situation right now. A pandemic, which we are still in and hopefully emerging from, that's another one that we have all experienced a little bit more personally in our own lives right here up close. Think about the ideological divisions that exist in our nation now, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or whatever you claim to be, you are in some kind of an ideological mix right now that is fairly unusual for our nation's experience. Climate change, that's the biggie. That is the real biggie. And we haven't had too much of an experience of that yet, but as I tell my children and 6 grandchildren, just wait. And they kind of look at me with a blank stare like people that age do. And I said, well, your look will be less blank as you go older because it's going to have a profound effect upon you. And so those are what I call public crucible situations that you are familiar with in one way or another. A little more closely to home, I talk about personal crucible situations. That can happen in a family life sometimes. Things go wrong, marriages break up, and children go astray or aren't what you thought they were going to turn out to be. Challenges to religious faith. And by the time I'm through with these 4 different presentations, I don't intend them to be a crucible of your religious faith, but you can't ever tell what people are going to make of what someone like me has to say. Ill health can really be it, and as you get older, I can tell you that ill health has got a lot to do with having a crucible situation for you. Aging just in itself, as I'm learning, and I used to chuckle at people in Spokane who would say, well, I can only do one thing a day, and I'd laugh, and I'd think, what's wrong with you? Well, I'm not laughing anymore. This is my thing. This is my thing for this Sunday, is right here. In any way, serious transitions usually make for crucibles. After I'm through with these 4 initial presentations, I'm going to be doing a series of 3 that goes back and looks at something you may or may not remember that I did for St. Jude's before Aaron came on board. I did those in an early iteration of Zoomed, and I'd never been on Zoom before when I did those. I was on Zoom from my living room, and so at any rate, that was about transitions, and I'm going to be doing something 3 times after this series about the kind of transitions that we're in nationally and globally, really, in a way. And so that's a little something that I hope will help you be able to personalize this idea about crucible a little bit more easily as I begin to talk about the Crucible of Faith, or the 200 years that preceded the birth of Jesus. And by the way, I'm open to any sorts of questions or comments or disagreements. I handle all of that. And if you have a disagreement about what I have to say, raise your hand or stand up, and I will listen, and I'll answer questions, but I'm not going to contradict you, because you may be right. You can't ever tell. So we're down to the bottom of the first page of this outline I have, and we're at the part which is called the second crucible before the birth of Jesus. And I'm going to read a summary about that from the book itself, because it really does summarize better than I can what I have to say about crucifixes. During the 2 tempestuous centuries from 250 BCE, before the Common Era, BCE, through 50 BCE, the Jewish and Jewish-derived world was in a fiery crucible of values, faiths, and ideas. So there was a lot of tumult that was going on in Palestine and in the Jewish world that Jesus was born into. So in a certain kind of a sense, Jesus was born into the crucible that began to develop 250 years before his birth. And his life and his ideas and his thoughts were certainly affected by what happened in that particular crucible, which I'm going to talk more about. That crucible emerged from wholly new religious syntheses, things getting put together in a new kind of way. Such a sweeping transformation of religious thought in such a relatively brief period makes this one of the most revolutionary times in human history. Very little known about it, though. This wasn't even talked about when I was in seminary in 1962 to 65. So all of this in this book is something that I had never heard about or read about until I read the book. And so if I'm unfamiliar with a lot of what is said in the book, it's because I'm still learning about it too and trying to pass on my impressions to you. Continuing with the quote, such a sweeping transformation of religious thought in such a relatively brief period makes this one of the most revolutionary times in human culture. These years affected Western consciousness, that's the way we think about things. In terms of its impact on human culture, the Crucible era is at least as significant as the more celebrated Axial Age. There was something called the Axial Age, which was a huge leap in human consciousness that occurred probably from 800 to say 500 or 400 BCE. And that was worldwide. There were religions in China, Japan, India that were formed during that period of time, and it's called the Axial Age. And there are actually books that have been written about that, which are interesting, which had been identified several centuries earlier and produced great intellectual leaps in societies as diverse as Greece, India, China. Just over 2,000 years ago, a new universe was created, one that we still inhabit today. So we're the inheritors of the sort of thing that I'm going to be reading about and talking about this morning. That emerging belief system, this new universe, was not the creation of isolated thinkers or writers who designed their religious system according to literary whim. On the contrary, these new ideas developed in a direct response to the cultural crises and political events of that era, and they can be understood only in that context. So people that made the kind of intellectual and value changes during the period that I'm going to be talking about didn't do that because they decided about something new. Rather, there was a huge collision of cultures that occurred that formed the world into which Jesus himself was born. On the contrary, these new ideas, the ones developed during the Crucible period, 250 to 50 BCE, these new ideas developed in direct response to the cultural crises and political events of that era. That period began with the Hellenistic kingdoms. Hellenistic means Greek, and Greeks thought and acted so much differently than Hebrews, they were almost unable to, you can't relate those two, but they collided in Palestine during the Crucible period. It was a collision of Jewish tradition and Greek influence that was created the Crucible. Things changed under heat and pressure. That period began with the Greek kingdoms that ruled the Middle East during the 3rd century BCE, a Jewish encounter with globalizing modernity. The people that lived in Palestine and were the inheritors of what we think about as the Old Testament were suddenly finding themselves besieged and ruled by a totally different group of people, the Greeks, who thought and acted differently than Jews thought and acted in their own time. These 2 centuries, were marked by such themes as the massive expansion of cities and commercial economies, persistent conflict between native people and foreign rulers, and the growing importance of Jewish communities which were living outside of Palestine. Throughout this period, Jews were in intimate contact with powerful religious and intellectual influences of the Mesopotamian regions, the Persian Zoroastrian beliefs, and the multiple philosophical currents of Hellenism or Greek thought. The Crucible area was incredibly fertile in generating new spiritual concepts and naming them. The rise of these new spiritual and political worlds created an urgent need for new words. A lot of new words were invented in this period, many of which remain at the core of Western religious vocabulary. Even offering a brief list of such words in English gives a sense of how much we owe this era, and some European languages include even more examples. These centuries needed a term for new and pervasive concepts of apocalypse. That's a word that comes from the Greek apokalypto, which means to pull the veil away or to reveal what somebody had not known before. That's what the word apocalypse comes from. Generally, a very difficult experience. Apocalyptic experiences are very difficult and trying. And also popularized by the words Armageddon. Armageddon was a battle that was fought much earlier in Jewish history in Palestine and was a very decisive and critical battle. And so a lot of people thought about what was happening then as another Armageddon. Even when older Hebrew terms were translated more or less literally into Greek, they could not fail to acquire new trappings from Greek thought and philosophy. So a lot of the language and religious language of this particular period was language that was translated into Hebrew from Greek. And when you make that translation, it doesn't come out the same way as the original Hebrew language. It means different kinds of things. Yeah, okay. Any thoughts or questions about that particular series of quotes about, I think, what describes best the situation into which Jesus was born? And most people, and when I was in seminary, and I guess in recent centuries, haven't really thought about Jesus in light of the kind of cultural environment that was his inheritance and which influenced him. Because people are influenced by their cultural environment. Think about your own family, for example, and think about the ways in which your family had a set of values and even terms and expressions and ways of relating and ways of doing things that have shaped the way you are to this day. So anybody growing up in a family is going to be influenced by the kind of cultural environment that your parents and their predecessors are passing on to you. So that's an illustration of the way in which people are influenced by the cultural environment in which they're born. If you think about your own, for example, I was born into a family in Texas, accent still shows it, that was very interested in architecture. My father was an architect. They were very structured in how they live. My daughters still laugh at the kind of structure that my wife and I live in and think that's very repressive. I think it helps out, but they've got their own opinion about it. But I grew up in that, and we have that kind of life between ourselves. And we look at our daughters and the way in which they're influenced by their cultural environment, more largely, and very different. And they kind of wonder about us and wonder about the kind of world no depression, born into depression. My father had to seek work. Along came World War II. That created an additional overlay to my own cultural crucible that I was in. Well, all that happened to the Hebrews that lived in Palestine on a larger sense. And so they were influenced by particularly the Greeks, and I'm going to be talking a little bit this morning about that particular kind of Greek influence that influenced and changed the way in which Hebrews thought about themselves, and therefore the way in which Jesus thought and the words that he used and the language he used, which shaped him and which we now hear about in what we call the New Testament. At any rate, the Crucible period that is talked about in Crucible of Faith was between 250 BCE and 50 CE, Common Era, after the death of Jesus of Nazareth. The container was Palestine. Remember, Crucible needs a container. The container was Palestine, mixing various dissimilar elements under heat and pressure. And this book goes into exhaustive, highly, this is written for academics, highly detailed information about the conflicts between Greek rulers and Hebrew rulers, and the way of the Hebrew religion and the Greek religion. It goes into exhaustive detail about that. Has charts about who the rulers were at certain periods of time. Has another chart about the various readings that many of which I've never heard of, but were formulated during that period of time in response to try and understand the changes that were going on in the Hebrew world. Some of those particular readings are in the Old Testament. Daniel is one of them. Enoch is one of them. If you ever remember Daniel in the lion's den, I'm not at all sure that was actually a literal description of something that happened, but rather it was how the Hebrew people wrote about what they were experiencing. And so we read it, and many people read that in a kind of uninformed way and think that they had these Meshach, Abednego, there you are, that those three people really are in a furnace and survived a furnace. No, the furnace was the crucible that the Hebrew people were in, and that's their way of writing about it. And so if you read something like Daniel, then you'll read about how the Hebrews talked about the situation in which they found themselves in very direct conflict, on every level of conflict, with their rulers, the Greeks, who came in and inherited Palestine. And so what we're talking about is the Jewish encounter with the inheritors of Alexander the Conquest. Now, you've heard of Alexander the Great? Alexander was a remarkable Greek. He was born in Macedonia, in northern Greece. Yeah, please.
Use your mic so people can hear who are listening, please.
Okay, put the mic. Not used to mics. There weren't mics in my day. You talk louder. Yeah, thanks, Penelope. And so I'm going to read briefly about page 32. Where's page 32? Here it is. 2132. Yes, please.
The 50 to 200 BC, and the collision between Palestine and Greece.
Right.
But you didn't talk much more about you had one God in one place and more plural in the other. And you didn't expand on that at all.
I'm going to right now. It's about to happen, Vince.
You're welcome for the lead-in.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to read to you here about that. 32. The coming of the Hellenistic empires vastly expanded the geographical scope of the Jewish world and raised Jewish awareness of distant lands and kingdoms. Thank you, ma'am. And kingdoms scattered over 3 continents. Here's what happened. Alexander was born in Macedonia, in Greece, and in his very brief life, and he lived to his mid-30s, he died very young. He died in India, and Alexander conquered Egypt, Palestine, Mesopotamia, Iran, Persia, and most of India in his very brief life. Now, along with his conquest came all the various cultural accoutrements that he had grown up in Greece, because he was Greek. He was not Hebrew. He was a Greek, and everywhere he went, he took the Greek culture and formed governments that were based upon Greek culture. And so it was a huge expansion of Jewish awareness of the world around them, which they did not have before that. Fairly insular, fairly isolated group of people. And so after Alexander died, and he died in India, I believe, at the age of 35 or 36, something like that. He must have worn himself out, plus he was a fairly dissolute individual. You can read about him. Fascinating story. His kingdom, which went from Greece to India, think about that. In his 32 or 33 years of life, he conquered everything between Greece and India. Remarkable story. And when he died, that inheritance went to several of his generals. His generals took over or petitioned various parts of his kingdom between Greece and India. Most important were 2 leaders who followed Alexander's death. One was a dynasty called the Seleucid, Seleucid dynasty, and that was from the Middle East, including Palestine. So suddenly, Jews living in Palestine found themselves being ruled by a Greek ruler, one of the generals that had fought with Alexander. So you can imagine, for example, what would happen in the United States if suddenly some leader from an entirely different background, set of ethics, you can say that almost happened here, and we're living with that. We're living with a miniature of that experience, really, brought a whole different set of ideas and personality to the people that lived in that particular kingdom. And that dynasty, if you were to look carefully at the Crucible of Faith, that dynasty existed for almost 200 years and was finally overthrown in the year 100 BCE by a family, a tribe of Hebrew people called Maccabees. And there is in some scriptures the first and second Maccabee. And I understood when I was in seminary that first Maccabee was studied by West Point for the military detail the conquering of the Maccabees over the Greeks. So finally, the Greeks were overpowered, but the Hebrews fought so much among themselves that they invited the Romans to come in and settle things. Romans were always very glad to settle things. And so the Romans took over from a very brief period of Maccabean rule, and they were, of course, ruling in Palestine during the life of Jesus. And Pontius Pilate, whom you're familiar with, was the governor, the Roman governor. He was not a Hebrew, he was a Roman. He was the Roman governor of Palestine and had around him a variety of puppet rulers like Herod the Great and a number of other different people. So the Hebrew people were discovered that they were being ruled by people who had an entirely different point of view about things. And the incident that forced the Maccabees to decide to revolt against the Greeks was the rule of a Greek king named Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Heard about him in seminary. And Antiochus Epiphanes was sure he was going to turn the Hebrews into Greeks. And so he slaughtered a pig on the altar of the temple. It was a step a little too far. And the Maccabees took exception to that, and they came in and fought Antiochus and won their freedom for a while. But they fought among themselves, and they needed somebody to come in and settle things, so they invited the Romans to do that. As I said, the Romans were happy to do that. And so in a certain kind of a sense, the Hebrews went from Greeks to Romans. Not that much of a difference. In Egypt, there was another inheritor of Alexander's empire, a group called the Ptolemies. And the Ptolemies were a dynasty in Egypt, and they and the Seleucids fought each other occasionally back and forth. Seleucids introduced Greek philosophical thought along with Persian Zoroastrian beliefs affecting the Jewish system that was already in transition. So can you get an idea about the kind of crucible? That's why this was an entirely appropriate title. What a crucible Palestine was in for the 200 years preceding the birth of Jesus. And there were many literary responses to all this, and I've listed some of them. Some of them are called canonical, which means they're still in the Old Testament, a part of the Old Testament that some Christians use and other Christians omit. I think the Episcopal Church includes, Penelope, is that true, includes that part of the Old Testament? Yeah. So we've got it, and you can read it. If you've got a scripture, an Old Testament that includes those, but some are disincluded. Well, here's a name for you: pseudepigraphical. That's a reading that uses the name of somebody that lived previously, but has been translated into something written more recently to give it authenticity. It's called a pseudepigrapha. Funny name. Deutero means an extra. Some canonical. Dead Sea Scrolls, for example. Dead Sea Scrolls, I don't believe are included in anybody's scripture, but the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by a group of people named Essenes who lived in this particular period of time during the time that the Greeks were ruling, and after the Greeks were gone, and into the time when Jesus was living in Palestine. Of course, the Essenes were defeated by the Romans in a great battle at a place called Masada, which Masada is a great fortress on a cliff in Palestine. It's still there. And the Greeks finally, the Romans finally, when they decided they were going to get rid of the Jewish influence, had to defeat the Essenes at Masada. And they built this huge earth ramp that went right up to the top of this plateau, and they got up there and everybody committed suicide. Pretty dramatic stuff, yeah. At any rate, Jesus was born into that crucible of faith, which affected how he thought and how his life was interpreted by other people. Some of the writings in the New Testament, which are interpretations of the life of Jesus, very much influenced by this Crucible of Faith, because everybody in Palestine was influenced by this confluence of Hebrew thought and Greek thought. Here comes another quote. Here we are. Yep. What we know about Jesus was written and recorded by his followers, who may well have adjusted those stories to fit the needs of their own times. Parenthetically, let me say that if you're a person who tends to read Scripture literally, without an interest to its writing and its formation, then you will have a hard time realizing that the life of Jesus is not recorded on a video. The life of Jesus are the memories that people had of their experience of Jesus, and were written, I think, largely to describe why Jesus was significant to them. If you're at all familiar with something called the Jesus Seminar, and we're going to be into that next week. Jesus Seminar was a group of academics who decided to try and understand what part of the Old Testament writings, especially the gospel writings, what part of the gospel writings were actually written by people who knew Jesus. Some knew Jesus, some didn't know Jesus. But if you read those as literal recordings of the life of Jesus, then you will have a hard time with some of this. I don't, because it doesn't do anything to my faith except help me to understand how other people understood Jesus. Okay. What we know about Jesus was written and recorded by his followers, who may well have adjusted these stories to fit the needs of their own times. Fortunately, that fact poses no great problems for the present purposes, regardless of whether Jesus himself did or did not say and think such things. If, say, he did not actually preach particular parables, then those ideas were certainly present in the minds of his Jewish followers a decade or two afterward. And we're going to start reading about that next week as we talk about after Jesus, before Christianity. And those writers presented their material in terms that they assume would speak to the needs and interests of their mainly Jewish audience. So we want to bear in mind that the Gospels were written largely in an effort to try and communicate the significance of Jesus to people who didn't know him or would have disagreed with him. The first members of the Jesus movement were, in every sense, heirs of the revolutionary developments of the previous 2 centuries, as was Jesus himself. Read that again. The first members of the Jewish Jesus movement, and it's interesting to notice that our own presiding bishop is now talking about us as members of a Jewish movement. Now that is a very interesting shift from institution to movement. Are you listening? Very significant shift in the meaning of the church from institution to movement. You're going to learn next week that what happened with early Christians after the death of Jesus was in no way an institution at all. It was a movement, and we're going to talk about next week what kind of movement that actually was and what it was like. Very different than what we experience now. Keep reading. The first members of the Jesus movement were in every sense heirs to the revolutionary developments of the previous 2 centuries, the Crucible, as was Jesus himself. The Qumran, those are the Dead Sea Scrolls, findings of the 1940s created new interest in that connection between Jesus and what was thought about him, and encouraged many overambitious theories about Jesus the Essene. Setting aside such far-reaching claims, the Qumran materials often do help us understand Jesus' world, and especially the precursor movement led by John the Baptist. My thought is that John the Baptist and Jesus were in many ways in contention, and that's the reason when you read the New Testament and John the Baptist appears, Jesus is always presented as preeminent over John the Baptist, because Jesus' followers wrote the book. And so they were interested in presenting a particular point of view vis-a-vis his major, I wouldn't say contenders, his major partner, John the Baptist. And I'm of the opinion that a lot of what Jesus thought about himself and understood about himself occurred as a result of his encounter with John the Baptist, who I think helped Jesus interpret him to himself, my opinion. If we do not link Jesus to the sect, the Essenes itself, they show how strongly his ideas resonated with the spiritual insight of the 2 centuries before his time. Echoes of the crucible years appear on every page of the Canonical Gospels. Jesus was above all a prophet of judgment and apocalypse. In the coming day of judgment, he said, the world's people will see, quote, the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out his angels and gather his elect from the 4 winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Jesus' world was dominated by belief in afterlife and resurrection, in future rewards and punishments. So that's how Jesus came to interpret himself in light of the ways in which the Greek had influenced the Jews before he was born. Complicated. I should probably stop right about there. Yeah, and see whether you have any questions or comments or disagreements with what you've heard me saying. Bearing in mind that all this is new to me, too.
Would you mind repeating your last sentence about Jesus and the Greek situation?
Reread part of that.
Yeah.
Sure, I can do that if I can find it again. Yep, here it is. Echoes of the crucible years. That is to say, what this book right here is all about. The ways in which the Jews experienced themselves as in a crucible. A mixture of Greek and Hebrew in intense heat and pressure caused by political events and conflicts. That's why Palestine was a crucible. Echoes of the crucible years appear on every page of the Canonical Gospels. That's what's in your Bible and my Bible, Canonical Gospels. Now, we're not so much talking about the letters of Paul, because those were written by a person who never knew Jesus of Nazareth, by the way, but claimed to know the Christ that Jesus bore and did know him. Appear on every page of the Canonical Gospels. Jesus was above all a prophet of judgment and apocalypse. Those are ideas that came with the Greeks and were laid upon the Jews, and were a part of the mixture of the culture that Jesus was born into. He was born into a culture that was struggling between Greeks and Hebrews. Very different than going back to David or Solomon or someone like that. No influence of Greeks, no Greeks at that point. And so the world that Jesus was born into a world that had been impacted by Greek thinking upon Hebrew thinking. And that's why it was called a crucible. Heat and pressure, lots of heat, lots of pressure, lots of conflict. And so when you think about the day of judgment, or you see here apocalypse, those are terms that were not so prevalent in Hebrew thinking, but had been imposed by Greek thinking, which Jesus was subject to. He was born and raised. That was his environment. That's what he learned. Jesus was not born into the time of Solomon and David and Samuel. No, that was 500 years before. And so the cultural influence that Jesus was born into, very, very different than the one that you read about when you read most Old Testament readings. Those readings were written before the Greeks impinged upon the Jews. Let's see. Jesus' world was dominated by belief in the afterlife and resurrection, in future rewards and judgments. And so if he came to understand himself about having an afterlife and being a particular kind of influence, that's because he grew up in a culture which allowed for that to be thought about. Was that wrong? I don't think it was wrong. It was just different than what Hebrews had experienced before the Crucible years. Did that help or not? Was that what you wanted to hear? Good. Yeah, Penelope. Please stand up and let them hear you.
It's interesting what you're saying about Greek and Roman culture, because when we go to museums and we think of Greek and Roman sculpture, mostly we think of Greek statuary that's then copied by the Romans, or Greek tragedy, those wonderful plays, Aeschylus, etc., and Homer and Virgil and different writers, and how that impacted Jesus. And it always interested me that they had amphitheaters, and so Jesus probably attended theaters.
No, might have.
As a young person. But it is interesting to me where apocalypse comes in from the Greek and Roman understanding, and if that's through philosophy, or if it didn't seem to be part of their pantheon, at least my understanding of the pantheon of Greek and Roman gods and goddesses.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe Mithraism, I don't know where that idea, those ideas
Appeared in Greek writing, Greek culture?
Yes.
Apparently they were there, but I can't tell you.
Okay.
I wish I could, but it's a very good question.
It's very interesting to think that that's the world that he lived in.
He lived in a world of tumult. Yes, Liz Cass, who my wife Marilyn's best friend, Liz.
When you mention it, it's like you're saying, I don't know what that word means. Even, I guess I'm not informed.
What word is that
I
again?
don't know what that word means.
Apocalypse.
And how that affected Jesus. What really is that word? I mean, when you say the word, I hear the word, but I don't get a meaning for the word.
It's a Greek word.
Okay.
And the Greek word is apokalypto. And it translates into English, apocalypse. And the word means having a cloth pulled away from something so you can see it more clearly. It's a word that talks about revelatory experiences that reveal what heretofore had not been known by you. They were covered. Penelope, you want to say apocalypse?
I understand, thank you. I understand
Thanks.
apocalypse as end times, and writing about when the world kind of comes to an end and everything is revealed, ripped apart, and we see a different reality, and often a very shocking reality.
Good. Let me give you a current situation which is somewhat apocalyptic. And I don't mean to be political about this, but it's going to sound like it. During the tenure of Donald Trump, we began to see an entirely different part of our national culture, didn't we? All of a sudden it was revealed to us something that had been previously rather hidden. And suddenly he represented or raised to consciousness that particular dimension of the American population and its culture. And right now we can see much more clearly as he was an apocalyptic figure in that he revealed something that had heretofore been not seen or not understood very clearly. Liz, does that help out? Yeah. And the term apocalypse generally carries with it the connotation of being very tumultuous and difficult and conflicted. And that's because when people can see something they heretofore hadn't seen, it really causes conflict. For example, if you've ever seen a situation in a marriage where there has been unfaithfulness, I'm just making then that is something, when it's revealed, really creates a lot of heat and light. A lot. And that's because it brings an entirely different understanding than had previously been held. Yes?
We have a question from online, from Kelly Messagian. So the idea that Jesus' followers...
You want to take off your mask so we can hear you, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
It goes like this. So the idea that Jesus' followers actually created Christianity is not new, is what is new about the presentation in Jenkins, the specific ties to the historical context, which we now know more about.
Mm-hmm. Know a lot more about it. Okay, that concludes what I have to say about the Crucible of Faith. And it's a very interesting read. Marilyn's reading it right now and finding it very interesting. It's a difficult read because it's got all kinds of writings and individuals whose names you've never heard of before and don't know a lot about. But if you want to know more about the creation of the world into which Jesus was born, here's a book that will tell you about it. I'm on number 5. Let's see how I'm doing in terms of time. I got 7 minutes. After Jesus Before Christianity, that is the second book, and this is the one that I'm going to be talking about for the next 3 sessions in more detail. It's also easier to understand. It's not as complicated a reading. The Jesus Seminar, whom you probably have heard of, and you may or may not like what they did, but they were pretty influenced. They came to St. Jude's a number of times, as I recall. The Jesus Seminar morphed into or transitioned into a Christianity seminar. And that's a study about what came after Jesus without the assumptions that we have about it. That's very interesting. And I think the Hills were people very interested in the Jesus Seminar. Jesus Seminar was a function of a larger group called Westar Institute, W-E-S-T-A-R, Westar Institute. And Westar, which produced the Jesus Seminar, then morphed into the Christianity Seminar, which is this is their initial publication after probably about 10 years worth of scholarly research. Interesting the way in which this is written. I'm not going to talk so much about what's in it as I'm going to talk about what's interesting about the assumptions they made in writing this. The book goes on to talk about it matters how you read history. Most people read history backward. That is to say, when they read history, they take along all their current assumptions and lay those on to what they are talking about in the past. The Jesus Seminar, and I have to believe that probably Christian scholarship and maybe the church has done that for us. That is to say, what we think about in terms of the very primitive church, and it wasn't a church, what we think about in terms of after Jesus was has an overlay of what we now know. And the Jesus Seminar says, no, we're not going to do it like that. We're going to read forward. We're going to start from scratch without the assumptions that we give to reading about knowing what the outcome is. We know what the outcome is because we're living with the outcome. But the work of the Jesus of Westar says that we're going to start from scratch. We're not going to assume that the way we see things is the way things were. We're going to go back and do the research about the way things actually developed. And so the Christianity Seminar chose to read forward, assuming nothing. They didn't go into the after Jesus assuming they knew anything and did all the research they could do in terms of producing this book about what early followers of the Anointed One, comes from the word Christ in Greek, comes from the word Messiah in Hebrew, Anointed One, one who's had oil poured on his head. And generally in the Hebrew tradition, a king was anointed a king when in the ceremony someone took a horn and poured oil on their head. And so this book is about people who understood that they were followers of the Anointed One. But there's no terminology about Christianity. There's no terminology about the church. There was nothing that we understand about the church that was part of their milieu. And so what was discovered by these people was not some kind of a uniform institution that we all assume exists, but rather what they discovered was more like a kaleidoscope, a whole mixture of different kinds of people and different kinds of gatherings and different beliefs. More a kaleidoscope and not identified predetermined pattern which subsequently emerged in pieces in place. Around the 250 CE, Common Era, everything had kind of come together and we began to have something called Christianity. Before that, what time does this start? 10:30? Oh, I'm okay then. People are wandering around looking like, what's going on? Who is this masked man? And so I'm going to consider the pieces of the kaleidoscope as described in this book in the following 3 Sundays, and it's under 5D. Resisting the Roman Empire. They were born into the followers of Jesus had to struggle with the Roman Empire. They didn't have to struggle with the Seleucids and the Greeks and Alexander. They had to struggle with what the Roman Empire was like. And so the book will talk about what the Roman Empire was like during the time after the life of Jesus. We're going to talk about what's called gender bending. Some of you are going to like that, some of you are not going to like it. But it's the term they use, and so you can resist it or... The reason they talk about gender bending is because the kind of families that grew up with followers of Jesus were not like Roman families. Very structured, depending upon your gender. The earlier followers of Jesus weren't that structured about gender. Some women were leaders, some men were leaders. Families. Interesting conversation about the kinds of, they call them friends of the anointed, or clubs, or supper clubs. And those proliferated in the Roman Empire, all over the place, with no cohesion, not necessarily much conversation between them. It was kind of a kaleidoscope. The following Sunday after that, we're going to talk about what it was like living in chosen families. You chose your family. You weren't born into one of the followers of Jesus. If you were a member of a followers of Jesus family, then you chose that. You weren't born into it. And the head of the household was not necessarily the father of the household. It could be the mother of the household. Very eclectic kinds of communities. Finally, the last Sunday, May 29th, diverse organizational structures and some of the oral traditions, the traditions that were talked about, finally got to be written down, and that's what a number of the New Testament writings came about as a result of what was written down and agreed upon between these various kinds of families. Jesus lived in a crucible, and what followed was kaleidoscopic. With Christianity in a current crucible, then the result could be kaleidoscopic. I happen to believe this book is important because I happen to believe that the religion we call Christianity is currently in a very difficult period of time. Now, I go around enough churches to know this. I was preaching at St. Andrews in Ben Lomond last Sunday. That is microscopic, let me tell you. They're only there, but it's dead of determination. And so I have been in enough different places to realize, for myself to realize, that the future of the institution of Christianity is very problematic. That's not something I'm happy about. I'm not pleased to tell you that. I think you realize that, Penelope. And I do believe firmly that St. Jude's is one of the institutions that's going to prosper. I think you're going to be fine. Got good leadership, good facility, good tradition. There's nothing about this place that isn't really pretty good. But there are a lot of places that are not that fortunate and are going to be St. Mark, Santa Clara. When I was ordained, I went to work for Ward McCabe. Remember Ward McCabe? I was one of Ward's boys. They were all boys then. And it was one of the strongest parishes in the entire diocese. It's closed. It's going to be sold. You had a series of clergy that weren't as competent as they might have been, and there was no saving it. So it had to be sold. They're gone. They're out of business. You have people here at St. Jude's, the Gorhams. Anybody met the Gorhams? Yeah, Judy, you met the Gorhams. They were there when I was there. I was a promising young man then. And so when you see Jack Gorham, you realize that man has persisted in the church for decades. In a very good family. So those families are now dispersed, and the facility is going to be sold. The facility, I think, recognizing the institutional form of Christianity. And that's going to be changing. Not in my lifetime particularly, but in your children's lifetime, it's going to be different, I believe. Let me conclude by saying that what I presented to you, I don't quite know how that impacts your own religious nature or your own religious thoughts. You're hearing mine, and I've tried to be as faithful as I can to Crucible of Faith. I haven't tried to diminish your faith, but your faith may have to become deeper than the institutional form of it. Say that again. Your faith may have to become more personal and more deeply grounded than the institutional forms of that. That means association with a particular place on the corner of Stelling and McClellan and the story of St. Jude's. It's going to have to deepen. Because if it doesn't deepen and it isn't there for your children and your grandchildren, it will go away. Too bad. And that's nobody in the room, and this is nobody's fault. It's the way in which our culture, which has been secularized, no longer a sacred culture, a secular culture, and the secular culture has no room for any kind of religious conversation whatsoever. Hate to tell you that. That's what we're in. Any thoughts, questions after all of that? Because it's time for me to sit down and wait for the service to begin. It's all yours, Penelope.
I'd like to say that the value of this kind of, thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say how much I appreciate the value of looking at history. We see it repeating ourselves. We see right now Mariupol is like Masada. And the issue of gender bending. Some of you may have seen our rector at Disneyland with Minnie Mouse ears and the red bow, you know, very comfortably bending genders. So lots of different things in what you say that are relevant to us and to our lives today. And thank you very much.
You're in a particular form of Protestant Christianity that has already accomplished a lot of things that are going to have to be worked on. We've been through a lot of it. We've been through the issues of ordination of women. We've been through issues of what do you do about same-sex people? How are they integrated into the church and welcomed? A lot of the kind of looking at Scripture from a more critical point of view has already been accomplished by the Episcopal Church. So we're already along the way in terms of adapting to what I believe is coming. There are a lot of churches that are not like that. Did you read the Mercury News yesterday about the exorcism? Wow. Headline on the San Jose Mercury News, exorcism deemed to be a homicide. And this is a little church which is called Iglesia de Profetas, Prophets y Apostoles, prophets and apostles. And some member of this little house church in San Jose, a family had a little child 3 years old. It was difficult. They decided to take that child in and exorcise them by starving them and trying to force them to vomit, and the child died. Go figure. Strange. Okay, that's all for this morning. I'll be back next week with After Jesus, Before Christianity. You're welcome. Thanks for your help, Robin.